What role does parliament play in Iran? Iranians are choosing a new legislature, and many hope it will pave the way for reform. But with a strict vetting system and anti-establishment candidates barred from running, is change possible in the Islamic Republic? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. Iran's parliamentary elections look set to be a major test for the government. While anti-establishment candidates aren't expected to win many seats, a low voter turnout could indicate extensive discontent. In 2022, the country was rocked by mass protests, and many Iranians are still calling for reforms. So how is the government responding, and what lies ahead for the Islamic Republic? We'll go to our panel in just a moment. First, Fintan Monan has this report.
Iran is electing a new parliament, but some in the capital Tehran are disillusioned. They don't believe their vote will make a difference.
I'm not going to vote because my experience from the previous result was not good. I don't think I'll choose anyone. I can't see anything new or any new statements. They're all just the same old slogans.
The biggest problem is people's lack of trust in the effectiveness of parliament.
The government insists there are plenty of choices. However, all candidates are vetted in advance, and some politicians who favor reform say they're barred from running.
The final number of qualified candidates was about 15,000 people from the 20,000 who registered, and naturally the rest are those who were disqualified or ineligible according to our country's law.
Many Iranians want change. In 2022, mass protests took place nationwide after a young woman died in police custody. Mahsa Amini had been arrested for allegedly violating the strict dress code for women. This prompted demands for reform, with some even calling for an end to the Islamic Republic. The government clamped down on protests and has since passed even tougher penalties for ignoring the dress code. Afifa Abedi is one of a handful of reformist candidates who made it onto the ballot. She says problems stem from women being excluded from influential positions.
Women, although very active in society, hold very small share of power. They only have access to positions of secondary importance, such as councillors or deputy minister for women's affairs. It is the men who make the decisions, even when they concern women.
With many reformist voices either disqualified or boycotting the vote, turnout is expected to be an important factor. If voters stay home, it could be a sign the establishment is losing popularity. Fintan Monahan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Tehran is Mohammad Marandi, Professor at the University of Tehran and Iranian political analyst. In Venice, Roxane Farmanfarmaian, Professor of International Relations and Modern Middle East Politics at the University of Cambridge. In Düsseldorf, we are joined by Adnan Tabatabai, an Iranian affairs analyst and chief executive of CARPO, a think tank focused on the Middle East. Welcome to the program. Mohammed, I would like to ask you about a general sentiment that this election could perhaps be one of the most delicate moments for the political establishment in Iran since the Islamic Revolution, 1979. How accurate is this characterization?
I'm not really sure, because ever since I was a teenager, during election times, they would say this is one of the most sensitive moments in the revolutionary period. So it's difficult to say. Obviously, the elections are important. The current administration, if the president wants to be reelected, he has to be seen as having strong support. If he fails to gain support, he could lose the election next year, especially since the economy isn't doing very well. Of course, his political opponents, like President Rouhani and his people, people still don't have great memories of the economy during that period. So it is a certain moment where People see the current administration as not performing extraordinarily well, and the previous administration not being very successful. But we'll see. It's difficult to say what will happen at this stage.
Roxane, many people who are closely monitoring the election this time are waiting to see how many people will show up at the ballots. Why is the turnout, voter turnout, very important this time?
Well, I think we can look back at what it was like 4 years ago. At the previous election, it was down 42%. This time, the latest polls are expecting about 41%, which certainly implies that the majority are not coming to cast their votes. I think it's a combination of both a very bad economy and a period of feeling as though they're not part of the political momentum, that the leadership has taken a direction quite different than that the populace is feeling. And so there's a certain degree of feeling that they are not, no matter how much they vote, they will not be engaged in improving their situation. And so I think there's a great deal of despondency involved. On the other hand, I think it's also become very clear that the leadership itself does not really care whether the population is voting or not. They don't see it as a implication on their own legitimacy.
How should we, Adnan, this is my question to you, how should we analyze a low voter turnout if it happens this time in this election? Is it discontent with the political establishment in general, or just with Ebrahim Raisi, or is it mainly because people don't trust that the government is going to improve their living standards?
Look, I believe we should look at it as in the way that we would look at it anywhere else. You have trends, you have, as Roxana said, periods of a time in which there is more satisfaction or content among the broader population with the state of affairs in the country. There is a period in which people have increasingly the feeling that they can shape politics in the country through elections. And I think it is fair to say that currently we are in a period or in a downward trend in that respect, that there is not much enthusiasm about elections. This has to do with all sorts of different grievances. This also may have to do with the way that candidates or the political establishment as a whole has managed to or failed to create that enthusiasm about political competition in a way that creates more voter turnout. So in that respect, we are currently certainly in a low.
Mohammed, would you expect a voter turnout similar to what happened in the past election, in the sense that it is going to be lower in urban centers and major cities, higher in rural areas, or the dynamics could shift anytime?
It is always lower in a city like Tehran, because the electoral law, in my opinion, is deeply flawed. For example, if I vote tomorrow, I will have to fill 30 names for parliament, and for another council that chooses the leader, 16. So I have to fill in 46 names for the whole city. And unlike in small cities where I have a relationship with the MP, I know who my MP is, he comes to my street or to my local school or to a local mosque or wherever, and I can meet him in his office. In Tehran, there is no connection between the individual and the candidate or the elected parliamentarian. We have the same problem in major cities as well, but in Tehran, it is the most difficult, and it's also very time-consuming. If you really sit down and write all the names, you could be there for quite a long time, and then the people in front of you have to do it, so you may be standing in queue for hours just to cast a vote. That's why parliamentary elections in Iran, the turnout is usually significantly lower than presidential elections, because for the president, you just go in, give the name, and then you leave. So traditionally, in Iran, the parliamentary elections are between 42 and 60%. It ranges. The lowest has your previous guest pointed out was 4 years ago. I don't believe that anyone in the political or the political establishment at large doesn't want to see a high turnout. But I think the major issue in Iran, according to polls, by far is the economy. It's number one, number two, number three, number four, in different ways it's expressed. And because of the sanctions, but also because of policy and mismanagement, the economy hasn't been doing well for maybe a decade now. And Mr. Raisi, when he first came in, there was optimism that he would be able to bring about change. So far, although at least last year the economy grew significantly, but people don't feel any change. They continue to feel that the situation is not good. So it's sort of like what was once said in the United States, it's the economy, stupid, as they would say. But again, and it's also true, by the way, for U.S. elections. The presidential election in the U.S., the turnout is much higher, but the congressional elections are usually in the 30s and 40s.
Roxane, is it fair to say that this is going to be purely, mainly just about economy and the growing discontent among people because of the increasing inflation, the sanctions that have been biting into the economy for quite some time? Is it just purely an economic issue here?
Well, it's certainly the economy that's the most immediate, that's on people's minds. And the currency has been dropping against the dollar, for example, quite substantially over the last 7 weeks. And the result of a downward trend is that more and more people are falling under the poverty line. And so these are immediate concerns. It's very difficult to find more goods in the markets that are affordable. People are really struggling. They're holding two jobs. So I think we are seeing the translation of what in the past certainly could have been an argument that it was both a political and an economic set of issues, translating into becoming primarily economic because of the immediacy of this.
Adnan, in theory, when people are frustrated with the performance of a government, like we look at the indicators, there is an inflation which is standing at 50%, the high consumer prices, and you have the flattening currency, you would assume that people would take that anger towards their leaders. But what we're seeing basically is that ultimately the Conservatives will still have a bigger say in the next parliament, and the Conservatives are likely to continue just to further consolidate their political gains. Does it make sense?
You could obviously say that elections are one way to interact with the state. And you can, of course, if you're discontent with the state of affairs and you have the feeling that engaging in elections and finding someone who represents or stands for the things that matter to you, then you have the opportunity to take this opening or this offer by the state structure, so to speak, to participate and in fact make sure that people are voted out that you no longer want to see in there. And this has happened quite often in the past 4 decades of the Islamic Republic. But as I said earlier, currently, this doesn't seem to be necessarily the case. There is a lack of representation for some of the topics and grievances that people have. They certainly have primarily to do with economic issues that were already mentioned, but there are obviously also cultural, social, and political grievances where we see a lack of representation or a lack of candidates that would, in a credible fashion, embody the grievances that people have or address them properly. So therefore, we are currently seeing a disengagement or a withdrawal, so to speak, from those who are not satisfied with the current state of affairs.
Mohammed, is the vetting process by the Guardian Council a major problem here? Because ultimately, when you look at the list of the candidates, you look at the environment itself, you get a clear sense that the choices are narrowing here in Iran.
It is always a debate, and it is a problem. But I think it is important to keep in mind that the United States did, especially in 2009 in Western countries, tried to interfere in Iranian elections especially in 2009. And the Persian media, which is funded by the West and based in the West, has always tried to influence the elections in one way or another, either by telling people to vote in a certain way or not to vote in a certain way or not to vote at all, or attacking particular people. So when the United States in 2016, at least when many in the political establishment claimed that Russia was interfering in U.S. elections, you had 4 years of crisis of sorts in the political establishment in the United States. In the case of Iran, the United States is a much larger power than Iran, and it in the West, when it interferes in Iran, it creates greater caution. So the system begins to become more cautious. It is more cautious about certain candidates who have connections abroad or with certain political parties abroad. So the United States and Europeans, if they're sincere about democracy, and they're not, I mean, genocide in Gaza, I think, has exposed everything. But if they were sincere about democracy, the first thing that they would do would be to stop interfering in Iranian internal affairs. And then I think you would automatically see things open up, as we saw in 2009, where we had debates. It was a really fantastic environment. Until after the elections, and then we had riots, and we're still experiencing the consequences of that in small ways.
Roxane, does that concern by the political establishment justify disqualifying the independents, the liberals, the centrists, and members of the Reform Coalition, to the point where people are saying that this is just tilting the ground for the Conservatives to take over once again?
Well, I think two things are going on at the moment. Firstly, this is a double election. This is an election for the Assembly of Experts as well, which comes around every 8 years. And that is the assembly that will be quite probably responsible for choosing or being part of the choosing of the next supreme leader, because Supreme Leader Khamenei is he's elderly, he's ill, and so the chances of him making it past the next 8 years are diminishing. So it's an opportunity for the conservatives to put into place, I think, people that the current leadership feels are responsible and that they can count on and that are part of their in-group, that will be able to then, according to their remit, choose somebody or a group of people that will run the country in the future. And that's a major change in the country's next future steps. And I think that's the second point that I wanted to make. When a country is looking at a major structural change, and we've seen this in many different countries, it's not just in Iran, the entire system goes into a point of being less flexible, being focused on trying to set the tone for the next stage. And so it is focused much, much less on bringing in different people, bringing in experiments of approach. And I think we're seeing that stratification very much in Iran at the moment, while at the same time the conservatives are trying to consolidate and take out the unpredictability for their next step.
Adnan, what future lies ahead for the opposition when they see themselves basically ejected from this practice and the conservatives further consolidating their grip on power in Iran?
Let me first ask what opposition you mean. Are you referring to, let's say, opposition factions within Iran that are trying to challenge
exactly.
The reformers,
the reformers in particular?
Look, I think it's quite clear that let's say the reformists and moderate factions, part of their demise, if we want to put it this way, has to do with the disqualifications, with the unfair political environment in many respects, but part of it is also due to their performance. And I would go as far as to say that even if less of their candidates had been disqualified, I'm not even sure that they would have been able or that they would be able to mobilize their constituents in a similar way that we didn't see that in the past presidential election or before that, the parliamentary election. So I think what really needs to happen in the, let's say, reformist and moderate camp, there are still remnants of that are competing in tomorrow's elections. But of course, it's a very, very weakened political group that will need to put its act together to generate a new generation, in fact. And of course, the political establishment has to open up, has to allow more space for them to have these new generation of politicians. And let me also very briefly come to the point that was referred to earlier by both Mohammad and Roxana, which is, in fact, we are dealing with a very securitized political context due to a transition phase in terms of potential future succession, but also because of the high tension that exists between Iran and external actors. And that leads to this closed political space we are currently seeing.
Mohammad, since Adnan talked about the rising tension in the region, particularly between the Americans and the Iranians, is foreign policy an issue that could further shape the outcome of the election? We've seen senior Iranian officials, including Ali Khamenei, basically saying that the war in Gaza is a reason why the Iranians have to show up in mass and vote in this election.
Yes, well, I should point out that he is quite healthy, but the elections for the Council of Experts, as they call it, that chooses the leader, of course, are very important. But yes, foreign policy, too, is key at the moment because the region is experiencing a major crisis, and we will probably see an expansion of the war, whether it's in Rafah, where the genocide will become worse, or the Israeli regime, in order to escape defeat, they will expand the war into Lebanon and carry out their atrocities there. And of course, Iran is the only government, internationally recognized government, that is supporting the resistance in Gaza, the resistance in Lebanon, and the government in Sana'a, and so on. So for Iran, it is a very sensitive moment and it is very important for Iran to be seen as strong. And for example, during the anniversary of the revolution, there was a large turnout, and there was the leaders and the president and the speaker of parliament, and everyone was calling people to come to the streets because they felt that a huge presence on the streets of Tehran would be sending a message to the West. The problem that we have in this region is that we don't live in a normal region. We live in a region where the United States and its allies manipulate, they turn countries against one another, they invade, they destroy, and they support genocide. So for Iran to be seen strong internally is very important. However, I should stress that parliamentary elections in Iran, if there's a turnout, let's say, of roughly 50%, that would be considered good under the circumstances. But in general, parliamentary elections, as I said earlier, have a turnout that are less than the presidential elections. And as I said, in particular in major cities, and in particular Iran, the turnout is always going to be low because of the parliamentary, the system of election that they've imposed, where you have to vote for tens of people literally.
Roxana, those who are going to take part in the election and those who will decide to stay away, to what extent will the war in Gaza, the potential for Iran to be drawn into a military confrontation with the United States of America, be a factor that could decide whether they go and vote or stay at home?
I don't think it's a huge factor. I think we discussed, the economy is much more immediate. I think the element of being engaged in a government that might make a difference if they voted. I don't think people feel that they have any control, that their vote will deliver any real benefits. I think the element of Gaza and the region is actually more important to the leadership, and it's because of an interesting paradox that's taking place briefly, that Iran is in many ways, because of its support for Palestinians and Palestine, speaking very much to the Arab street. So we're seeing it throughout the region that Iran's message is resonating with the populations that whose own leadership are actually approaching the situation rather differently. And yet, interestingly, it's Iran's population that is not supporting its own government that much. So we see a dichotomy here, and I think that's where that issue is playing out, rather than really affecting people's choices to go to the polls.
Adnan, Roxane, early.
One point?
Briefly, Mohammed, yes, go ahead, please, go ahead.
I agree that the main issue is the economy. That's absolutely correct. But polls in Iran also show that Iranians overwhelmingly support the people of Palestine and Gaza, and they support Iran supporting them. There is a division in Iran about that, but a strong majority do support Iran's policy in that regard. But it doesn't give the government an excuse to poorly perform economically.
Adnan, briefly, if you don't mind, the Assembly of Experts, which is going to be also elected, the 88 seats of the body, is it going to be a crucial moment? Is it going to be the next assembly to decide the next successor of the supreme leader?
I mean, look, it's not gonna be the one critical moment, but it's definitely gonna be important in the sense that it is another step in a certain direction. It's very, very difficult to say what the formal processes will be like. Should there be to define a decision about the future of the supreme leader's position, it is clear to say that, of course, it is a very sensitive time, and it is important to make sure that people are chosen into this assembly. This is the government's view, or the establishment's view, that people are represented in this body that will shape the country in a direction that is in line with the political establishment's thoughts. So there is no real questions, no real risks allowed, no real arbitrariness should be left there. This is obviously far too sensitive.
Mohammad Marandi, Roxane Farmanfarmaian, and Adnan Tabatabai, I really appreciate your insight. Looking forward to talking to you in the future. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.